All right. Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum speaker webinar series and podcast. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Dexter Van Zile, managing editor of MEF's Focus on Western Islamism, join us to discuss land acknowledgements and delegitimization of Israel. Mr. Van Zile will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Dexter Van Zile.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Dexter Van Zile, and I'm the managing editor of Focus on Western Islamism. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, which might seem somewhat tangential to my work as managing editor of FWI. And I have to admit that I have somewhat of a personal vendetta against land acknowledgements and the institutions that promote them. And it was aroused most recently on Father's Day in June, when my wife and two daughters basically went along with me and we visited Edith Wharton's mansion in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and it's known as the Mount. And Edith Wharton, as most of you probably know better than me, was a famous writer who won the Pulitzer Prize, I think in 1936, for her book, The Age of Innocence, a book that I've never read, but I have seen the 1993 movie. And the Mount is a wonderful property that I drag my family to periodically whenever we go to Western Massachusetts. So we paid our $20 a piece, and they handed us a map and a brochure to the property so that we could go on a self-guided tour of the house and the surrounding garden and avert our eyes, from the politics of Western Massachusetts. I'm sorry about that. But as we were walking the property, I saw a passage in the brochure acknowledging the property we were touring was built on land previously owned by the local Indian tribe, the Mohegans. And I said to myself, really? Edith Wharton? And the thing is that I really shouldn't have been all that surprised, because I had seen a similar passage in a brochure for campgrounds in Western Massachusetts. And the reason why I was so offended is that I've concluded that land acknowledgements are part of a woke campaign to delegitimize the United States Republic and demoralize and demonize its current inhabitants. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that I actually think that that plays a role in tolerance for Islamism here in the West, or particularly in the United States. And for me to see Edith Wharton's home in Pittsfield become, if you pardon the expression, part of the occupied territory of woke ideology is fairly dispiriting. Now, we've all seen an awful lot of these woke land acknowledgements. If you've gone to a college graduation, there's a very good chance that you've seen that. And if you go to any public ceremony or institution that's part of essentially the nonprofit world, particularly that leans left or essentially requires government funding and good relations with people on the left for government funding, you're probably going to see some sort of land acknowledgement offered. Now, the thing is, one example of a land acknowledgement can be seen, for example, on the website of Wellesley College. It acknowledges that the United States removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of indigenous lands and the attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and language. And they go on to say that we further acknowledge the oppression, injustice, and discrimination that indigenous people have endured, and there is much work to be done on the important journey to reconciliation. Now, with somebody that's a little familiar with this, the fact is that Native Americans in the United States, the war between those two communities is over. The notion that we need to reconcile ourselves with the tribes that lost the war over the land is frankly ridiculous. And we've worked to legitimize our claim to the land through treaties. And recognized tribes enjoy semi-sovereign status in the United States, and in many instances, they exercise these rights by building casinos on tribal land. And a number of tribes play a significant role in the management of the salmon harvest and habitat protection in the Pacific Northwest. And so they have become players in essentially the public policy in the United States. And in some instances, there was one commentator that said, if you are a member of one of these tribes, you are what you can be called a super citizen. Now, that might actually be a little bit too rough, but the important thing to recognize is that I don't want to undermine that we don't have an obligation to basically maintain good relations with the native peoples of North America and help them out when they have problems on their reservations. But these land acknowledgements do very little to help the native peoples in North America, and that was never the point. It was never the point of these acknowledgements. The point of these land acknowledgements was to do to young people in the United States and Canada what anti-Zionists have been doing or have been trying to do to Israel for the past several decades. Demoralize and disorient the current inhabitants of the land and render them incapable of defending the political order in which they live. Now, when I use the words demoralize and disorient, some of you are probably reminded of Natan Sharansky's 3D test that he used to determine whether or not criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And he argues that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic when Israel's adversaries demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to Israel. And the thing is that one of the things that I concluded during the course of my work dealing with this type of rhetoric was that it wasn't just intended to basically turn Westerners against Israel, but to make Israelis feel less confident that the state that they lived in and that they were defending was a legitimate enterprise in the modern world. And there's a certain utopian element that's always used to delegitimize Israel, and I think that utopian ideology is now being used to delegitimize the West. And one of the things that I would like to do is to add 2 Ds to this test or to this this rhetoric, so to speak, or this analysis, hermeneutic, if you forgive me for that word, is disorientation and delegitimization. And the goal is to disorient people so that they cannot recognize the benefits that Western civilization has presented to the world. And I think, to plagiarize Daniel Pipes a bit, the West has given the world democracy, free markets, and the rule of law, which in turn have created an unprecedented stability and affluence for huge numbers of people throughout the world. And yet we have huge numbers of people, particularly young people in the United States, that have engaged in, that believe that the West is somehow the source of all evil. And this was a point that was driven home for me in 2020 after, while I was at a rally in front of the White House, excuse me, not the White House, the State House in Massachusetts. And what happened was that it was an anti-Israel rally organized by some BDS protesters that were trying to piggyback on the BLM Antifa riots that were basically rocking the nation at the time. And they wanted to basically hook their carriage to that energy, so to speak. And so one of the things that they did was that they spoke about both Israel and the United States as illegitimate nation states that really had no right to be here, no right to exist. And essentially, there was an analogy. One of the things that they talked about was Turtle Island. And Turtle Island apparently is the land that the Native Americans are supposedly inhabited before white people came to North America. And the thing is that to a certain extent, what they were doing was trying to create the idea that there was an Edenic political system in place before white people, white settlers, the European settlers came to North America, and that everything was just wonderful. And there was a recent article in the National Review that said, look, the notion that the native peoples who lived here were innocent and did not engage in conquering and aggression against other tribes. Essentially, the sedentary tribes were essentially being overrun by the Sioux and other tribes that had learned how to ride horses. So the interesting thing is that you can draw an awful lot of analogies between the methods used to delegitimize the United States and the West in general and what has happened in the Middle East. It's almost as if the anti-Western left, the Occidentalists, so to speak, basically used all of the techniques or came up with all of the techniques to demonize a country and then essentially started to deploy them against the West in general. And I think people who are more knowledgeable about this will say, well, that came from the Soviets. But the thing is that, you know, that's beyond my ken right now. But the interesting thing is that as I started to watch what happened at this rally, essentially this Native American, he was a native Indian or from Louisiana. They couldn't even find a member of a local Indian tribe in Massachusetts. He led about 200 college students in this primal scream. And he basically said, you know, scream out all of your shame and guilt. And we caught it on video. And if you want to see it, you'll see it. You can see it on my YouTube video. And the interesting thing about this is that they all just screamed out their shame. And then afterwards, he basically then granted them citizenship in this new fantastic utopia. Claim your land was one of the last things that he said to them. And essentially, I think this is really one of the most troublesome elements about what woke ideology is doing to young people in the West. And it had its model in what was people tried to do to the Israelis during the Second Intifadas. And it had a real impact. If you look at what happened under the Oslo Accords, essentially that was, and you want to read Ken Levin's book, The Oslo Syndrome, essentially what that was an attempt on the part of elites in Israel to come up with a way to essentially protect Israeli citizens and achieve peace without maintaining a monopoly on force in the disputed territories, in the areas where the Palestinians live. And the thing is that if you look at what has happened here in the United States over the past few years, we abandoned our monopoly on force in many of our cities, largely as a result of a similar narrative deployed against the United States. And I've already spoken about this previously, but if you watch the interview that I did with Richard Landis, essentially the Mohammed al-Dura case, that was a narrative used to basically frighten. There was a narrative in which a young boy was allegedly killed by the Israelis, and he probably wasn't. And the evidence is very strong. But essentially, they were used to portray Israel as an evil country governed by evil people, inhabited by people who were immoral and indifferent to the demands of humanity, being a good person. And if you look closely at some of the narratives about the police shootings that have taken place here in the West, particularly the one in Missouri a few years ago, essentially there was false information broadcast about it was the death of Michael Ferguson. So the land acknowledgement, Turtle Island, if you want to, has its roots in the notion that the Palestinians had a sovereign state in the Holy Land prior to the Jewish people, okay? And I think that what we're starting, and it's coming together in my mind, is that essentially the same techniques used to delegitimize Israel are now being deployed largely against the West. And I saw this primal scream, and then what happened was that after the primal scream, they went down to the ADL offices and then shouted hateful things about Israel and the United States, and also against the Democratic Party. And what it was essentially a large campaign of disorienting young people about essentially the legitimacy of the state or the political systems that has given them everything, and has actually been a great source of benefit for humanity for the past 200 years. And so I think this has real strong knock-on problems or effects. I used to be a deacon at a church here in Brighton, Massachusetts. It's a neighborhood of Boston. And right now, essentially, if you walk past this church on Thanksgiving, they will talk about essentially handing the land back on their bulletin boards out in front of the church, handing the land back to the indigenous peoples. And they ask what people are going to do in order to basically help the indigenous people. And I think that ultimately what this is an attempt to do, and the regular messages on the bulletin board that basically are used to delegitimize the political order and the presence, frankly, of white people on the land, okay? And I think that this is, if you look at the woke ideology, what it does is that it's a combination of two things. First of all, it promotes it divides people into various people groups or various racial groups, people of color and white people. And then what happens is that it legitimizes the grievance of the people of color and promotes a sense of guilt on the part of the white people. how do you get out from under that sense of shame? Well, in 2020, you could actually go and join a crowd and scream out your shame and guilt. But one of the things that I have seen when I interviewed Umar Lee and Israel Royer, these were two young white guys in their 20s who, in the course of interviewing, it became patently or very clear to me that they were unhappy with the state of race relations in the United States. And one of the things that did was that it basically convinced them or encouraged them to cast about for another identity to embrace. And as a result, both of them for a short time or for a while were Islamists. And so I think that this is really one of the interesting things that I think we should consider is that ultimately wokeism essentially sets a stage for people to be willing to embrace any sort of identity that will get them out from under this finger of accusation, and that Islamism is actually one of the ideologies that some people in the United States will embrace, largely as a result of a desire to get away from that accusation and that finger pointing of blame all the time. And one of the interesting things that is going on, and I said this to some of the people, you may have heard me say this on a call, is that if I were a young white kid in his 20s who didn't think that he already belonged to the one true faith, okay? And I was interested in achieving my developmental tasks as a young man, getting a job, getting married, and having kids without any interference from a larger ideology, I might consider converting to Islam, because if you look closely, one of the things that it's done is that it's basically, if you look at activism, particularly in Montgomery County, in places like Hamtramck, Michigan, and other places, they are making an explicit argument to defend their families that essentially I think a lot of other communities have basically kind of abandoned. If you look at the book that Rod Dreher wrote called The Benedict Option, one of the things that he talked about was essentially we're going to have to retreat from an awful lot of these conflicts. And so I think that, and I don't want to make it too, well, I think there's a 1-2 punch going on. And I don't know whether or not there is any sort of, plan to this. I think it's kind of an ad hoc campaign. But what we have is we have people basically being inculcated with the notion that the West is bad, and that they are not entitled to the good benefits that the West provides to them. And the one way to essentially get out from under that sense of guilt and shame might be to actually embrace another identity. And one of those identities is going to be Islam. And as a result, we may actually see an increase of support for Islamism on the part of, that may be one of the attractions that we see. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first one is from Daniel Pipes stating, "Thank you, Dexter, for the fascinating analysis. Is there more than a theoretical connection between the anti-Zionist and anti-American efforts? That is, are the same personnel involved?"
In some instances, many of the same personnel are involved. There was a group of activists that were involved in the BLM movement that went over to Bethlehem and essentially basically embraced and were handed the anti-Zionist rhetoric lock, stock, and barrel. And I don't think that they knew very much about the Arab-Israeli conflict at all. But essentially what they did was they basically portrayed the indigenous peoples and the African-American community or people of color in the same agenda or same parallel universe as the Palestinians. And I think that's really what's going on is that there's a group of people out there that are essentially trying to lay into the victim energy that the Palestinians embraced and deployed very effectively over the years. They're trying to deploy that here in the United States as well.
Thank you. From Ira Strauss, given that, as you say, the land acknowledgements are a stage in a larger effort to delegitimize America, Israel, and other Western countries, what further stages could be anticipated if this process is not turned back? What could be the long-term consequences?
That's a really good question, and one that I haven't thought of what happens next. And that's usually, and for that, I failed you, and I'm sorry. But I think maybe one of the things that prompted me to think about this on hopefully a deeper level was I read a book of The God That Failed, which was essentially about a group of young people in the 1920s and 30s who essentially embraced communism and supported the Soviets largely because of the guilt that they had over the privilege that they enjoyed in wherever they grew up. And not all of them, but there was about 3 or 4 of them. That was they said, yes, that's why we joined. And the thing is that I think that is what is going on now is that anything that they can do to basically make the people feel as if the system that they belong to is illegitimate, and that I think we should probably look at pre-Soviet, pre-revolutionary Russia. We might want to read the Brothers Karamazov, or what was the book, the Demons, or The Possessed by, was it Karamazov who wrote that? And he basically talked about how a whole group of intellectuals essentially engaged in self-hate and then embraced a sense of nihilism. And I think that be on the guard for nihilism. And the problem is that if you promote this ideology of white privilege, anything that is done to help young white people accomplish their developmental tasks can be seen as a political act, and it can be seen as an act that basically promotes oppression and racism. And so I think anytime you see actions on the part of people on the left that disrupt the ability of people to pass on their middle class bourgeois culture, you can basically say this is part of this campaign. And what they're going to replace it with is not a good thing. But I think that's really what we're looking at. And the thing is that for a lot of people, Islamism may actually represent a legitimate alternative to that bourgeois culture. And I think radical leftism will as well. And yeah, so I think that's where my eyes are headed next. So.
Thank you. Ken Moskowitz asks, aren't the Jews the indigenous people of the land of Judea and Samaria? Therefore, why not use the left's language and philosophy against it?
I have 2 responses, and they're both visceral. Legitimate, reasonable arguments in defense of Jewish rights don't always carry the day, and I don't know why. And I spent almost 2 decades making those arguments. And I think, and then another thing is that I think that's just really what it is. And also the left doesn't, and I don't mean to disparage the entire left, but I think that an awful lot of leftists are really not interested they're interested in deploying arguments that are going to advance the power that they seek to obtain. If it helps them achieve power, that's what they'll do. And they will judge an argument's veracity or value based on whether or not it allows them to take power. And I've been reading Edmund Burke more and more, and I think, there's an awful lot of people out there that want to achieve a utopian agenda, but they have no idea or don't want to pay any attention to the evil that they introduce in the pursuit of that agenda, and it's very frightening.
Thanks. Dana Fine asks, how do we fight this anti-American and anti-Zionist media? And she also says, thank you, Mr. Van Zile.
All right. I think one of the things is that I think, first of all, one of the reasons why I'm happy about JNS. I like to see JNS, the Jewish News Service. I've seen a number of articles for them, because one of the things that they've done is they basically have said this is the narrative of, they've worked to actually pursue truth, and I think that they're going to. And I think a number of non-Jews rely on JNS, by the way, for reliable information about the war against the Jewish people, and in turn, a war against the West as well. And so I think that's part of it. I spent a long time actually fighting and countering anti-Israel propaganda And one of the things that bothers me is that the same arguments keep coming back. I think in the long run, and this is not directly related to my work as managing editor of FWY, but I think that ultimately Israel's going to have to achieve some measure of decisive victory over the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and make it so that they no longer are able to actually use force or violence to terrorize Israelis. And they're going to have to do that in a pretty and it's a difficult process, and I am not a military guy. Look, I served in the Peace Corps, okay? So, but the important thing is that once that violence comes to an end and the Palestinians no longer feel the need to legitimize the violence that they're perpetrating and know to themselves and to the rest of the world, and that they can go, and if we can get the Palestinians to stop fantasizing about Israel's destruction, then what that will do is basically make them stop being such an invention shack for anti-Western propaganda. And the thing is that it will also, I think, kind of stop the war in American Jews that we're starting to see. I think once the Palestinians give up the ghost, quit attacking Israel, and pursue a future of their own that does not include Israel's destruction, I think a lot of the evil that we're starting to see targeted at Jews elsewhere in the world, well, maybe not in Europe, but at least here in the United States, will be lessened, because that unfinished business of the 6-day war, I have concluded, is what fuels an awful lot of the craziness directed at Jews in the West. So.
Thanks. Madan Lal asks, are there Jews and Israelis who are sucked into this woke ideology? And if yes, how large a movement?
Well, that's one of the things that I think Ken Levin is an expert on in his book, Oslo Syndrome, but I've seen him. I've seen him. I would periodically go to the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences in the West Bank, and there was always a fair number of liberal Jews that would participate. Mark Braverman is one of them. The guy who founded the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He would circulate amongst the anti-Zionist West all the time. But I don't think, and I'm not an expert on Israeli politics and polling opinion, but they don't have much traction in Israel. And one of the things that I used to say to the people in the anti-Zionist left or the Christian community that demonized Israel, I say, these people don't have any traction in Israel. The only people who listen to them are folks like you living in the West, because it essentially makes you feel good about yourself and is used as cover to hide your guilt over attacking one Jewish state.
Thank you. Mark Hager asked a little tongue-in-cheek question here. Should Israel get in front of the issue by posting signs such as tribal land of Judah or tribal land of Dan, etc.?
I think mockery works. I think that at a certain point, if you can engage in outright mockery and go, what's the word I'm looking for? What was that TV show from Great Britain where they all acted crazy and were very funny? But if you can go Saturday Night Live on, so to speak, I think you can win. And I think that might actually be the way to do it. And interestingly enough, Ryan Bellerose, who is a member of the Métis tribe up in Canada, affirms the tribal rights or the indigenous rights of the Jews in the land of Israel. And he gets in an awful lot of arguments with other people who live in other native North Americans or First Peoples. They say, well, why are you siding with a white man? And he says, look, the Jews are the indigenous people in the land that they're fighting over. They were there first, just like we were. And I don't know how much traction he gets, but he does actually help reveal some of the craziness of the anti-Zionist propaganda.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the half hour. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Dexter, for hopping in today and joining us.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update with Ashley Perry, and our regularly scheduled webinar for today will be happening on Friday. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.